Families, so you take it from court records, church records, everything else, and you build a case for examining the Civil War based on a population favoritism, who supported the Roundheads, that is the Parliament, who supported the Royalists, that is supported the King, where do they come from, is it a consistent study, and so forth. It's right. But the problem is, when you write about it, those become the things that you are using in terms of instead of a narrative text, you're going to plug that in as the information that you're presenting. That can get very dull very fast, as you can imagine. And also, but it's a challenge to try and do it, because it's the one area where social history, I think, really has a valuable thing to teach us. If we could just figure out what it is. That's the big problem. There's just tons of books written on the English Civil War. Now, when James came to the end of his reign, 1625, his Spanish policy failed. His domestic policies were in shambles. He was constantly at odds with the Parliament. Not favored by much of anybody. The country had barely got back onto its war footing with Spain in order to launch again the privateering, all those things that they wanted to do, to bring money back into the crown, money to the government. He had still maintained the divine right of kings, which meant that his authority was greater than anything that Parliament could possibly put over on him. So it was a twisted affair. His son had failed in the Spanish marriage. His Secretary of State, what we call basically today the Foreign Secretary, First Secretary, whatever he was, and that's the Duke of Buckingham, the King's favorite, King's lover, so forth, was in disrepute. So the government was at a very low stage at this point. He lost every battle that he ever had with Parliament. He lost the right of suspension of habeas corpus, which we talked about, meaning what? You cannot just arrest without warrant. You have to have a legitimate reason, a warrant to arrest. This is definitely not the England of Henry VIII. It's a changed world. So when he died, everybody expected there would be certainly an improvement in the relationship between the Stuart monarchy and Parliament.
He died in 1625?
1625. Not certainly the worst king that ever lived in England, not typically the worst. I think probably pretty just man, very moral, very ethical. As I said before, he was not street smart, so he did not know how to get along with Parliament, and simply had a pale really put over him in the last couple of centuries. People thought Charles I would be the successor, was going to be probably a much better, a much brighter boy. Turns out, dates 1625 to 1649, and we'll sort of set this up to let you know why this isn't going to be a good reign, because 1649 is not just when he died, it's when he was executed by Parliament. That gives you a little note on where we're heading with this. Parliament never executed anybody before, and this is the only time it ever happened. Later, during the French Revolution, when the French citizens executed Louis XVI, Britain declared war on them for being a regicide nation. They kill their king. I think that's very funny. Okay. It wasn't funny to Louis XVI, but.
Lost his head off.
But
He left his head off.
But no, yeah, Louis. What's the old joke? Louis Capet lost his kaput. But you have to be our age to appreciate what a kaput is. Okay, right? Yeah. Okay. I won't demean her any further by comparing her with my age. Okay. I promise. Okay. So comes to power. The crown is already in disfavor. People are hoping for the best. This king is far more obdurate than James I, meaning that he is a hardhead par excellence. He comes to the throne not writing a thesis on divine right, but utterly believing it because his father had written it, and he's a firm believer in this idea. He's very quickly confronted with a massive amount of pamphleteers operating in Parliament, the Puritan pamphleteers, who challenge his rule, challenge his theory on divine right, and get themselves into a lot of trouble, and they are busted, just like the Ashland PD would do to you coming out of Omar's at the wrong time. You are busted just upon appearance, and you are imprisoned, and your ears are cut off. Puritan pamphleteers are not in great favor. This king was not going to worry about the legal proprieties. If you criticized his rule, you were subject to arrest and subject to, not execution, but subject to having your nose cut off and your hands cut off. And of course, you're sort of a marked person after you have to go through that. People look at you, I guess you did make some foul remarks. You did, yeah. And so you have that issue going on. This king is going to carry on like his father wanted to, but far in advance of his dad. Executions and so forth. And so Parliament now in 1528 came out with it's a prelude of things to come. It's called the Petition of Right, 1628, the Petition of Right. You have no right to arrest or imprison without due process. King can't just order arrest any longer. Of course, he objected, but Parliament passed it. Majority of Parliament passed it. Puritans were all for it, of course. You could not just arrest, you could not just pick somebody up and torture them, put them on the rack, cut off their nose, cut off their hands, because they criticized the reign of the king. I mean, if that was the case today, half of us would be pretty maimed, because we feel that the right to criticize the government is, especially in America, is an inalienable right. And the right to criticize all the government, including both political parties and the president, is a super right, which is absolutely major part of the Constitution. Of course, we know it's not. But the thing is, we assume it is because that's the way we are, okay? Now, this is a real crimp in the system. He needs money. But he doesn't want to face Parliament. He doesn't want to sign the Petition of Right as a part of the legal development of what we call the English Constitution. The English Constitution, by the way, is nothing like the American document. Zero. It's a series of documents based over centuries, starting with things like Magna Carta, Petition of Right, later the Bill of Rights, and so forth. Each one having a very special and significant addition to legal procedure, and it's quite different. It's based on tradition. It's based on popular consent of both the sovereign and usually popular consent of Parliament. And it grows over a long period of time, and it's definitely tied to tradition. it's a great series of documents. It is not an orthogenic, meaning straight line development of a constitution, because it'll vary in various terms, it'll be various times, separated by decades or centuries, the various documents that go into what is the English Constitution. But it nonetheless has built into it a lot of precedent, meaning that based on what's been going on before, this is how we're going to interpret now and in the future, based on what has already been interpreted, how it's been interpreted. But it's not sometimes the orthogenic sort of constitution that we think of. It's going to be to continue this thing after the right of petition, the Bill of Rights of 1688, which is a big one, huge. You're going to have the Reform Act of 1837, which grants the right of upper class, or let's say middle class and upper class investors and landholders the right to vote, which they had not before. 1867, again, another Reform Act, which grants the right to vote to workers. Mill workers, all kinds of workers, with a very small property qualification attached to it. Later at the end of World War I, we have another bill that's passed giving women the right to work and allowing all workers, no matter what their property status is, everyone the right to vote. So these are all parts of this English constitutional system. So if you're looking for a single document, don't do it. The first one being way back, Magna Carta. The right of nobles. It's sort of essentially nobles have rights. As if you never thought they didn't, but the fact is they challenged the king. King went after them, and ultimately at Runnymede, Magna Carta is signed by King John, by the nobles. So rights for nobles. I mean, I feel sorry for nobles. They just didn't have all the rights together, and I mean, there's room for pity here, right?
Right.
They own all the land, but you know. Anyway, but it's a process. So we talk about a constitution here. We're talking about a document drawn up here that's written over a period of several months. At the time, just right at the end of the Revolutionary War, and then put together to replace the old Articles of Confederation. So it's a very different procedure. Okay, now, this king decides to not ever speak to Parliament again. Okay. Good luck, long duck. All right. So what goes on here is that you have you know, that's not a bad idea. He knows he's in fundamental disagreement with this Parliament about almost everything. He's really a family man. He already has his first child. And this period is it's an 11-year period from 1629 to 1640, where there is no Parliament. Zero. Never meets with him, never calls him, wants nothing to do with it. And the thing about it is that ruling without Parliament meant you didn't have any problems. Nobody's going to argue with you. You can call up and call on or bring to your presence individual parliamentarians that may be screaming and yelling, but you know what? If they're not meeting in Parliament and discussing issues dealing with this king, I guarantee you nobody is giving a lot of thought to the king or to his problems. If you didn't have Congress meeting today discussing Obama at every turn, no matter who you are, there would be no collision. There would be no criticism. If you're out there back in Texas digging ditches, or whatever you do in Texas, if you're here in Oregon, you know, in the Illinois Valley trying to rob exotic plants like the Darlingtonia. Ever seen the Darlingtonia brand there? They're insect eaters. It's like the Venus flytrap, only bigger, really big. And don't fall into a mess with those guys. You're loose, okay. But if you're not, I mean, if you're not doing your thing, you're not meeting, you're not discussing, and you're not giving vent to what can be political opposition. As long as you keep Parliament scattered in the various counties where they belong, you're not going to have any issue with it. They're not getting together informally discussing anything. There's no pay for Parliament at this time. These guys are not paid. You have to, what they call stand for Parliament, meaning you have to afford to raise your own money to be sent to Parliament, to live in London, and this is where your finances are going to come from. You have to raise the finances. It's not a paid position. We don't understand that in this country. We want to be paid for doing absolutely nothing in Congress. Well, the thing, it actually worked. It's not so much that he got anything done during those 11 years, but the fact is there was no collision, there was no hostility, because they're not meeting together, and there's no, but this is where the problem comes. Every time you face a political collision in history, you've created a forum that allowed the opposition to come, you've created a forum that allows the political opposition to come together. In the case here, it's when you call Parliament again, you damn well know that they're going to come right back where they were 11 years ago and start the same bullshit, right? You also know in the French Revolution the same thing happened. Have they not had the meeting in Versailles of what? The Estates General. Hadn't been called for 165 years, but they show up at Versailles, all the political opposition comes together at Versailles, and they go after the king. You keep that political opposition scattered, you don't call them for any particular reason, they have no forum to discuss their issues, to discuss their bitches and their gripes. So 11 years goes on here, and nobody sees this coming. 1638-39, he's appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury and a new Foreign Secretary, new sort of Prime Minister. Prime Minister is, you don't use the word Prime Minister yet, it's not in vogue, but the word was First Minister, and he probably dealt with foreign affairs. His name was Wentworth, W-E-N-T-W-O-R-T-H. Wentworth was a non-Calvinist. Member of Parliament, supported the king. Just as importantly, he supported what's known as the king's prerogatives. Only the king has the right to call the army, only the king has the right to recreate the navy, only the king has the right to appoint who his ministers are going to be, only the king has the right to appoint who the Archbishop of Canterbury and other bishops of the church will be. That's the king's prerogative. It always has been. And Wentworth is a champion of that idea. Now, the big thing is here, he appoints somebody else as well, and that's the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this Archbishop happens to be notorious. That's not his name, but that's what he is. He's notorious. His name is Archbishop Laud, L-A-U-D. Laud is not a Calvinist. He is not a Puritan. He comes from a faction of the church that's opposed to Calvinism, that many people confuse with Catholicism. And this faction in the church is known as Arminianism. Now, how many have ever heard of it? Armenian? Okay. That's not the same thing as Armenian, like living in the Caucasus and killing Azerbaijanis and exotic animals and being persecuted by the Turks. That's the Armenians. But Arminian, A-R-M-I-N-I-A-N. A-R-M-I-N-I-A-N. They are lower middle class income. They do not represent the elite. They do not represent nobility. Their theology is one of, they're the predestination theology of Calvinism. They support the idea of free will as opposed to predestination. They believe in good works as opposed to the idea that shows up in Calvinism, that God saves you whether you want to be saved or not. You're predestined. and God chooses you. We talked about the area in predestination in Calvin called TULIP before. We did this before. TULIP, total depravity of man. U, unredeemed humanity. L, the limited atonement. I, irresistible grace. And P, perseverance of the saints. All that means basically is God chooses you, you have no choice. You're going to get saved whether you want to be or not. And you're going to make it all the way to the end. You can never go to hell once that happens. Arminians said, wait a minute, what if you're a total schmuck? And you're out there, you've committed murder, and you've done all kinds of things, you betrayed your wife, I mean, you're out there, God knows doing what, ripping people off all the time. Doesn't matter. Calvinists said, once you're saved, you're always saved. You're there. Part of the group. You're part of the elect. Arminians said, that's nonsense. Free will enters into this, and if you blow it because your will is to do wrong things, evil things, God is not going to accept you, and therefore we believe in seeing some good examples of good works. And so what they built back into the church, or trying to build back in, and under Archbishop Law, they're going to build back into it, a stand on ethical morality back in the church based on free will, which is the Arminian position. Now, have I lost any of you on this? Because I'll tell you one thing about this period. The religion is very important in this period.
Why would anybody have a problem with putting good ethics back into the church?
Well, because they don't feel it's dependent upon that. And here's the reason. The old Catholic system was a system of essentially gaining merit through good works, through the sacraments of the church. Okay? Brownie points, so to speak. It's based on works, based on staying above the fray by good ethical performance and good works. The sacramental system is a system that taps into the good work idea. The Calvinists come along and say that is not biblical. Biblical Christianity is the fact that God initiates this relationship. Whether you have good works or don't have good works, He chooses. You become part of the elect. Even if you blow it during life at various times, you're still part of the elect. It's a really oversimplistic overstatement of some ideas that came out of the very early church based on the teachings of St. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine was sort of a prelude, a very broad prelude to the Calvinists, that they really see him as their, and they trace theology this way. You can do it very easy. The theology of the Apostle Paul is seen to be much more toward faith as opposed to works. Okay? Augustine, 4 centuries later, seems to support that idea. In the 15th or 16th centuries and 17th, the Arminians in the Church of England, the Calvinists in the Church of England support this idea. So Calvinism has this long kind of history that traces itself back to the Apostle Paul. Now, I'm not saying, I wouldn't dare say that that's a correct interpretation of Paul or Augustine or anything else. What I'm saying is that's how it's traced. In the opposite direction, the Arminians trace their, I'll get your question. I'll ask your question first.
I was just wanted to kind of clarify, didn't the Calvinists also, their rationale was that if you were graced by God, you would be doing the right things, you wouldn't be one of the degenerates, you'd be successful doing the right things?
Yes, but we also know that people didn't do that. And so,
Right, but didn't they
yeah.
like try to prove it to themselves that, oh, by being good, almost saying that I must have been graced by God because look how well I'm doing, sort of thing.
You can do that. I think that's an acceptable position, that some did believe. It's just hard to make it firm in every case. The Arminians trace their spiritual ancestry back to a rival of Augustine in the 4th century, whose name was Jacob Arminius. That's where they get their names. Jacob Arminius, who believed in free will as opposed to Augustine's predestination. The Arminians traced and then that group in the 4th century traced their spiritual ancestry to the Apostle James. And let me give you 2 phrases here. The Apostle Paul said, faith without works, or James said, faith without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. That's James. Paul said, the just shall live by faith. No mention of works. Not by works has he saved us, but by our faith. So it looks like you've got 2 very separate ideas going on back here. I don't think you really do, but that's a whole theological question, but I don't think there is. I mean, I think there's, what is going on, what went on in the 5th century, what goes on in the 16th, 17th centuries, is the attempt to define these 2 camps to the exclusion of one another. You can't be one and also be the other. You can't. Whereas in the scripture, there's room for both. Even though people don't understand how that works, I don't either, but there's room for both. But in modern theology, there is no room for both. They are mutually exclusive. So they become very hardened as far as denominations. And you take a really tenacious political period, as the 17th century was in England, and you put this theology in action on both sides, you've got a looming disaster. Because you've got people who already don't want to compromise on any issue, and you add religion to it, you add an intensity that's going to make it far worse than just let's say, just a political collision. Any questions? Was there another question? Yeah, John.
Was there some overlap in that when James says that faith that works is dead and the just will live with faith, to live, to act
Sure.
life accordingly to faith?
Yeah, I think James has I mean, when Martin Luther translated the book of James, now Luther was not, Luther came around, he's at least 10 years before Calvin shows up. But Luther looked at James and the idea of faith without works is dead. And to Luther, works was what? Indulgences, penance, all the Catholic precepts that he thought were non-scriptural. Okay. So Luther made a statement about the book of James that I think Calvin would have picked up on and ran with it. And that is, he said James is a strawy, meaning a totally dry and unchewable position. James is it's a strawy epistle, meaning I don't want anything to do. He didn't like it. He had to accept it because it's canon scripture. And he believes sola scriptura, only scripture. But he didn't accept the parts he didn't like.
Yeah.
Okay, this is like some of the Muslim fundamentalists we have today. They take they take the Quran, parts of the Quran they want to use in order to launch jihad and attack other Muslims, attack anybody else, because they're going to take those parts of the Quran they want to use. And we have Christians do the same thing. It starts right here at this point in the 17th century. This is a perfect time. This is the perfect storm, so to speak. Unpopular king and unpopular. So you have this unpopular archbishop who decides to, what some have said, to Catholicize the Anglican Church with putting more rules, regulations back into it. In other words, adding more works to it, adding more ritual to it, things that have to be done. And he manages to offend everybody. But what I'm trying to tell you here is the slight bottom, the footnote to this, is he's not really reinstating Calvinism, Catholicism into the church as the accusation has normally been. But it's a form of Christianity that comes out of the old Catholic Church, meaning the Arminian position. Works. All kinds of works, including the works of the sacramental system, including indulgences, whatever it might be. but he's suggesting that but he's not a Catholic. This is an Arminian. Arminians are Protestants. Okay, now, let me see if I've forgotten anything on this issue. Probably have, but anyway. It's a collision that's very difficult to ascertain, to understand. I'm trying to explain it, and I blew it already because I misquoted. Just, I don't ever put this on a test, but the guy that opposed Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries was not Arminius. Arminius is the current guy that we're dealing, that's opposed to the Puritans of Parliament. The one that I'm looking for that opposed St. Augustine in the 4th century was a theologian named Pelagius. Now, I know, heresy, you're over the top, why don't you just go home? Pelagius. Pelagius. So you have this stream from Arminius to Pelagius to James. The other side from the Calvin, Puritans, Calvin, to Augustine, to the Apostle Paul. So you got those two lines, and that's still very much a part of the church today, at least theologically. And I'll just simply undercut that by saying, you know, the vast majority of people that go to church today have no knowledge of any of this stuff at all. They don't understand it, they couldn't explain it, and they wouldn't want to. A lot of them just don't believe much of anything anyway. So you're wasting your time just trying to discuss this guy with a lot. Now with the fundamentalist churches, more conservative, they might have an idea. You talk to the Calvary Chapel types, you know what Calvary Chapel is? You know what the type is? They're sort of freewheeling, came out of a tent back in Orange County way back when, as part of the revival movement of the early 70s in this country. They almost have no theological base at all. They discount all denominationalism as if they are not one. But almost any group that emerges saying they're not a denomination are a denomination. You can't help it. Once you organize, you're a denomination. Okay? So anyway, coming back to this issue, this king now has got a problem on his hands because what Archbishop Laud does is puts all of the emphasis on changing the Book of Common Prayer to make it more Arminian. It's the word Arminian friendly. Good works friendly. You have to earn some of God's favor. You don't just get it because you look good or you don't look good, whatever the case. As soon as he did this in the year 1640, all hell broke loose. Because the first group he tried to do this to was to Anglicize and to Arminianize, or if you want to say Catholicize, the Church of Scotland. What are you doing hopping to Scotland to start your problem there? It's the Scots Presbyterians. They are avid Calvinists, just like the Puritans in Parliament. Result, a fairly sizable invasion of northern England coming from Scotland within a year. And everybody said, what the hell is going on? Where did this come from? Scotland's part of what? The United Kingdom. It's under a crown union. For God's, what are you doing? You're attacking your own country. I mean, what are you doing? So things really get screwy here. This is why historians love this period. You can say anything you want because nobody knows. It's you know, the best man win. We're not ever sure who that is. So here comes this attack. The king now has to respond. He's king. He has to defend the realm. In this case, he's got to defend one part of the realm against another part of the realm. He has no money. He hasn't seen Parliament for 11 years. He's got no money. He's got no support in Parliament. Worst of all, he has no army. What is he going to do? He's going to try to get a quorum in Parliament in order to get some money to raise an army to stop the Scottish invasion. He's got to protect the people across the border. Okay. He calls Parliament. This is called the Long Parliament. I think you can imagine why. Once Parliament gets established and comes together to discuss the issue, they don't want to go home. You have now brought together, essentially, you brought together a whole group with a, now you've created the classic forum for malcontent. They're all together now, and the king's with him, and he needs money, he needs to raise an army, and they're saying, we got you, shithead. We finally got, 11 years it's taken, but we got you.
You said quorum. Did he have to use, did he try and use the minimal?
He tried,
amount
it
of
didn't work,
Parliament?
he couldn't get anywhere with it.
And did they all just show up instead? or-
Eventually, he has to call everybody because they won't form, the quorum will not vote on anything.
And what percentage of Parliament?
He got a good turnout.
A good turnout?
Ultimately, he got a very good turnout, because they're after him.
Okay.
They want to come together. We want to talk. Can we talk? Yeah. That works. And so here they show up. Over hill and dale, guys haven't seen each other for 11 years, you know, and they pick up their conversation like it just left off last week. And they're fuming mad. They can't stand Bishop Laud. They can't stand Whitworth. These guys represent the old school. They represent the king in his, you know, in a very different position. They don't support it at all. So Long Parliament, 1640 to 1653.
Wow.
Once they meet, now remember, Elizabeth met 35 months out of 45 years.
Yeah.
This is a parliament that's going to meet, what, 14 years out of the next 14 years. The whole time. They never disband.
Wow.
A long parliament. They all now form an opinion against Charles. That he's inept, he's an idiot, and he's got the worst ministers. We could do better in appointing our own ministers than Charles ever could. The two ministers are immediately arrested, Archbishop Laud and Wentworth. Wentworth is executed. They didn't want to execute the Archbishop. I'm not sure why. Yes.
Where did they have the authority to do that?
They didn't. That's the problem.
Then wouldn't that have given the king the right
Yes.
to chop all their heads off?
No, it wouldn't give the king anything. But they don't have the right to do what they're doing. They don't have the right to challenge the king's appointees.
But since they
that's the
committed
legal
a
issue.
crime, wouldn't that give
No,
him?
no. Because he already has to, you've got to have parliamentary support for executions. King doesn't have that. You didn't have to during the days of Henry, but you do now. That's how parliaments gained in power over the last generation. Okay. So Laud is arrested, he's in prison, and Wentworth is executed. Question, please.
Did Charles actively support Laud in his Arminianism, or did he just sort of let him go and didn't realize how controversial it would
Charles seems, Charles's own belief system in terms of Calvinism versus Arminianism does not seem to have any sense of real theological, you can't get a theological take on it, let's put it that way. But he supports Archbishop Laud because Laud wants to really tame the Puritans in Parliament. And that means also taming the Presbyterians in the Scottish Parliament. Same thing, one thing leads to another. So he's really on the side of Laud. He appointed Laud as his main man. And Laud is just clumsy enough to try and do it. The result is total chaos. Now, there was an author, Margot Todd at Vanderbilt, that I met at the Huntington Library. I was doing research there some years ago, and she was writing her PhD dissertation on this subject, on the Arminians during the Reformation. And I remember every time I encountered her, she always says, "Oh, I'm Margot Todd, I'm from Vanderbilt." But she wouldn't believe me. I said, "Fine, I'm so thrilled that you're from Vanderbilt. Fuck you." It's just kind of shit we go through. As academics go through a lot of crap. But she was writing her book, and she went to the footnote. Footnote was a little cafe at Dunning Library, outdoor, and we used to, all the people who were doing research there would go there and have lunch. And she started discussing her thesis, which was that the Arminian movement was basically a 100% economic movement, lower middle class, and nothing to do with religion. I was, nonplussed. I had no idea what to say to this, except, how is it that you can teach at Vanderbilt and believe this? Or anywhere else? Because this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I mean, you're Arminianist. They are totally tied to religion. You may not be. You may be a secular humanist in the 21st century, or 20th century as it was at that time, in the late 1990s, but the late 1980s. But this is total nonsense.
What were some of her supporting factors?
She didn't have too many, and she got the book published anyway, and here come the reviews. And the reviews are exactly what I told her. I didn't review it. She didn't ask me to review it. No, the publisher didn't either. But I remember thinking, this is like, you can't have this as part of the Reformation and not have some kind of religious base to it. Because that's what this period's about. It's not about economics, yes, but economics secondary to the religious issue, which is always tied to the economic issue. Well, anyway, Margot went to, she's now working, I forgot where she went, but she's not in Vanderbilt anymore. But I'm glad I didn't talk to her anymore either. Okay, now, immediately the problem came up, and it's what you referred to a minute ago. And that is, Parliament's now charging they could do a much better job of all these things that the king's doing. So in their attempt to challenge the king, this thing gets complex. It's already complex. A number of Calvinist ministers said, okay, we should be able to appoint the king's ministers. Meaning the Archbishop of Canterbury, meaning the king's first minister, Chief Justice, the treasurer, foreign secretary, all these things, these ministries are all going to develop into very distinct ministries in the future. Right now they're somewhat vague. But Parliament has the right to appoint these people. Not the king. The king's made some very poor choices. Parliament has the right to raise the army and raise the money for the army. That's Parliament should be doing this. Parliament holds the purse string, so Parliament should be doing it. The problem is that Parliament now, which was united against Charles, now splits on this issue. Wait a minute, they're saying, because this is very big in English history, you don't just do that because you don't like the king. You don't just do that because you disagree with his policies. This has to be based on some kind of precedent. This is a civilized country. This is a country of traditions. We have never, in the tradition of Parliament, has Parliament ever raised the army? Has Parliament ever raised a navy? Has Parliament ever declared war? Has Parliament ever appointed the ministry of the king? Ever. These are historically, traditionally, the king's prerogatives. And you don't just fucking do this because you feel like it. Because you don't like the king. Or you don't like his policies. Or you don't care for his theology. This is, you've gone over the top. So it's a big issue. In England, violating a long-term tradition is really a major offense. These things have been around forever. You don't just change this. This is why the country, of all the countries in Europe, I think probably has had the greater amount of stability. One civil war, but on the whole, huge amount of stability because of this, because this is the constitutional position. Even though you have to wade through 12 to 14 documents to find out what the, over a period of 5 centuries to find out what the constitutional position is, this is it. Yeah. Question?
No.
Okay. Anybody else? Question? All right. Well, so a number of Parliament begins to side with Charles. The Puritans now have a slight majority in that particular part of Parliament known as Commons. Many in Commons were far more radical than those in the House of Lords. So without warning, they raised their own army. Never been done before. Ever. If you find one time in English history where anybody has ever raised their own army, except for the private armies of the old feudal nobles. I mean, out of Parliament, raised a parliamentary army. It never happened before, ever. Yes?
Did the House of Commons have any power at all?
They have some power. They do. They have a majority of some things. It's very, and Lords can override it. Lords can veto whatever Commons decides. But not if you're at this stage of the game in the 17th century. If they decide to override, that itself could be a cause for a war. Parliament divided among itself. Lords versus Commons. Yeah. Is there another question? Okay. All right. So almost immediately.
When did he do that? Or when did Parliament do that? Raise their army? What year?
This is now 1640. And you have two groups emerging. Those support the king are called the Cavaliers. Mostly from central England and the west, with some scattering in the east, but mostly the stronghold of the west is Cavalier country. Support the king. Many of these guys are from are nobility, from the House of Lords, or upper middle class, and support the House of Lords. Cavaliers, typically mostly horseback, supply their own weapons, their own swords, their own pistols. What they have a lack of, however, is any artillery. They make a very fine cavalry unit, a lot of it. And they're going to raise an army based on that. On the other side, you have the parliamentarians, the Calvinists. They raised an army of what are called the Roundheads. Roundheads because of the haircut given to those in the infantry made up of the lower classes, supported Calvinists. And it looks like a medieval tonsure. You know, you've seen the medieval haircuts, guys with the monks, with the hair cut around the little ball and spot. That's this haircut. That's kind of going to get next week. I'm going to see if my barber can do it. I want a round head haircut. All right. Fighting breaks out between these two groups. And it's no wonder that ultimately it's the Roundheads who win this war that breaks out. Why? Because most of their support comes from the east and the southeast, which is the industrial and commercial area of England. They have the money. They have the ability to produce weapons, and they have the ability to produce artillery especially. They also have the moral vigor on their side. They have the pamphleteers, and one of the greatest pamphleteers that shows up and writes for them is John Milton. What did John Milton write? Anybody?
Paradise Lost.
Right. Paradise Lost.
Oh, yes, I have that.
Great theological statement, whether you believe it or not, is nonetheless heavy duty. They have the moral fiber, they have the moral emphasis, and they begin to develop hymns to sing along with their marches. the beat of their drums, the muffled drums, and they will run roughshod over most of England. You're gonna kill off probably 750,000 people in this war. It's a long-term vicious war that breaks out. 750,000 people. The population of England at the time, debatable, probably 6 to 7 million. So this is a pretty big dent in the population.